Story 1. The Silent City. It was a Tuesday night in late October. The kind of night where the air hung heavy with the promise of winter, and the city lights usually painted a vibrant tapestry against the inky sky. Eleanor, a night shift nurse, in her early 30s, was just settling in after a particularly grueling shift at the hospital. Her small apartment, nestled on the 10th floor of a bustling downtown high-rise, was her sanctuary. The rhythmic hum of the city below, a constant lullaby, usually lulled her into a much-needed sleep. Tonight, however, an unsettling stillness permeated the air. The clock on her bedside table glowed to 47 a.m. Suddenly, the world outside her window vanished. The vibrant tapestry of city lights dissolved into an absolute, suffocating black. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant drone of traffic, even the faint murmur of her neighbors, all ceased. An unnerving, profound silence descended, so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. Eleanor fumbled for her phone, its screen a dead, unresponsive rectangle. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no power. It was a useless slab of glass and metal. Her emergency flashlight, usually a reliable beacon, flickered once and died. Its batteries drained from a forgotten camping trip. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at her skin. This wasn't just a power outage. This was different. There was no distant flicker of streetlights, no emergency generators kicking in. The entire city, as far as she could see from her high vantage point, was swallowed by an impenetrable void. It was as if a giant hand had simply extinguished every single light source, leaving behind a terrifying, boundless darkness. The silence outside was the most disturbing part. Even in a citywide blackout, there should be something distant: sirens, the shouts of confused residents, the general murmur of a metropolis in disarray. But there was nothing, just an unnatural, heavy quiet that seemed to absorb all sound, making her own ragged breathing sound deafeningly loud. A cold dread began to seep into her bones. This felt deliberate, orchestrated. She crept to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass. The vast expanse of the city below was a terrifying panorama of nothingness. Skyscrapers, usually adorned with 1,000 twinkling lights, were now monstrous, silent monoliths. The streets, typically alive with the glow of headlights and neon signs, were indistinguishable from the black asphalt. It was as if the city had died, leaving behind only its skeletal remains. Eleanor's nursing instincts, honed by years of crisis management, urged her to check on her elderly downstairs neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He was frail and lived alone. She grabbed a heavy antique brass candlestick from her mantelpiece, its weight a small, cold comfort in her trembling hand, and stepped out into the hallway. The air was still, heavy, and strangely cold, despite the apartment building's usually consistent temperature. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to devour all light. She could barely see her hand in front of her face, relying on memory and the faint outline of the door frames. As she approached Mr. Henderson's apartment, she noticed something profoundly unsettling. His door, usually securely bolted, was ajar. A sliver of inky blackness yawned open, inviting her into the void. A wave of apprehension washed over her, but concern for Mr. Henderson pushed her forward. She pushed the door open slowly, the faint moonlight filtering through the hallway window, casting long, distorted shadows. Everything was in its place, neat and orderly, just as he always kept it. But the silence inside was even more profound than outside. It was a silence that felt expectant, like the apartment was holding its breath. Eleanor called out his name. "Mr. Henderson, are you home?" Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. She walked through the living room, her hands outstretched, bumping into familiar furniture. Everything was normal, yet profoundly wrong. The air was stagnant, heavy, as if no one had breathed it in hours. She checked the kitchen, the dining room, empty. Then she went to his bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open slowly. The bed was neatly made. His nightstand held a worn copy of a classic novel, a glass of water, and his reading glasses. It was as if he had just stepped out for a moment. But he wasn't there. And the silence was deafening. It felt like a presence, a heavy, unseen weight pressing down on her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, like old parchment and dust, hung in the air. She was about to leave when she noticed something on his dresser. A small, ornate, wooden music box. It was open, and a faint, almost imperceptible melody seemed to emanate from it. A tinny, distorted, nursery rhyme. Eleanor leaned closer, her heart pounding. The music box was not playing. It was completely still. Yet, the melody was there, a ghostly echo in the profound silence. It was barely audible, a whisper of sound that seemed to come from inside her own head, a chilling, melancholic tune that twisted familiar childhood innocence into something sinister. Eleanor backed away slowly, her brass candlestick trembling in her grip. The silence outside was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, a predator waiting in the dark. She stumbled out of Mr. Henderson's apartment, pulling the door shut behind her, the sound of the latch clicking unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. She ran back to her apartment, fumbling with her keys, locking the door behind her. Every shadow a potential threat, every creak of the old building a phantom footstep. The air in her apartment felt thin, suffocating, as if the silence from outside had seeped in and stolen all the oxygen. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her living room, the brass candlestick clutched in her hand, its cold metal a stark contrast to the rising heat of her fear. Hours crawled by. The air grew colder, despite the lingering warmth of the day. She could feel the hairs on her arms standing on end. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A massive heat, a localized atmospheric anomaly, but none of it made sense. The silence was too complete, too absolute. It felt ancient, primal, as if the world had reverted to a state before sound, before life. It was a silence that spoke of forgotten things, of a world that had existed before humanity, and would continue long after. She started to hear things then, or thought she did, faint whispers, just at the edge of her hearing, like 1,000 tiny voices, murmuring in unison. They weren't distinct words, just a low, continuous hum, a collective sigh that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the darkness. She squeezed, her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it only intensified, seeping into her mind, filling her thoughts with a creeping dread. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could almost make out individual voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow, she felt their meaning. They spoke of emptiness, of forgotten places, of things that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. It was a chorus of despair, a symphony of forgotten souls, a chilling lament that resonated deep within her bones. Then, the temperature dropped even further. She could see her breath in the air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could almost make out individual voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow, she felt their meaning. They spoke of emptiness, of forgotten places, of things that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. It was a chorus of despair, a symphony of forgotten souls, a chilling lament that resonated deep within her bones. The air grew heavy, with an unseen presence, a cold, ancient entity that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Eleanor remembered looking out the window, through a tiny gap in the curtains. The moon, usually a bright orb in the night sky, was gone. The stars were gone. The sky was a vast, inky blackness, devoid of any light. It was as if the entire universe had been extinguished, leaving only this profound, suffocating void. And in that void, she felt a presence. Not a physical presence, but something vast, immense, something that was watching, waiting, observing, its unseen gaze piercing through the darkness, settling on her, a cold, calculating intelligence that saw everything. The power returned just before dawn, a sudden, jarring jolt of light and sound. The refrigerator hummed back to life, the streetlights flickered on, and the distant sounds of the city slowly returned. Eleanor collapsed onto her couch, trembling. The memory of the profound silence and the ghostly nursery rhyme etched into her mind. She called Mr. Henderson later that morning. His phone rang, and he answered, his voice cheerful and normal. "Oh, Eleanor, good morning. Did you feel that little power flicker last night?" "Nothing too bad, thankfully." She asked him if he had been home. He said he had been asleep in his bed. She asked him about the music box. He said it hadn't been touched in years. She didn't tell him about the silence, about the ghostly melody, about the profound sense of dread. He wouldn't have understood, but she knew. She knew that for a few terrifying hours, her quiet apartment building had been swallowed by something ancient and cold, something that thrived in the absolute absence of light and sound. And sometimes, late at night, when the power flickers, she still hears that faint, distorted nursery rhyme, a chilling reminder of the silence that once enveloped her world, and the unseen horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception. Story 2. The Whispering Wires. It was a frigid January night in 2023. A sudden, unpredicted ice storm had swept through the rural countryside, coating everything in a treacherous glaze of ice. Liam, a reclusive writer in his late 40s, was deep in the throes of a new manuscript. The rhythmic click-clack of his vintage typewriter, a comforting companion. His isolated cabin, nestled deep within a dense pine forest, was usually a sanctuary of peace and quiet. Tonight, however, the silence was broken only by the relentless crackle of ice on the trees and the occasional groan of the old cabin settling under the weight of the storm. The clock on his antique mantelpiece read 11:34 p.m. Suddenly, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently, then died. The world outside his window, already a monochrome landscape of white and gray, plunged into an absolute, biting darkness. His phone, a relic from a bygone era, was dead, its battery long since expired. The internet, a luxury he rarely indulged in, was down. The silence was broken only by the relentless howl of the wind, the sharp crack of breaking branches, and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling under the weight of the ice. He fumbled for his old battery-powered radio, its static hiss a familiar comfort in the overwhelming quiet. He was huddled under a pile of thick wool blankets, trying to stay warm, when he started hearing them. Voices, faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but slowly growing clearer. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the darkened rooms of his cabin. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of them. They weren't distinct words, more like a jumble of overlapping conversations, a cacophony of murmurs and hushed tones, a strange, disjointed symphony of human speech. It was like listening to a dozen different conversations happening simultaneously, all just beyond the edge of his comprehension, yet strangely compelling, drawing him in. Liam tried to rationalize it. The wind, perhaps, whistling through a loose window pane. Or maybe the old pipes, groaning under the strain of the cold. But the voices were too distinct, too human. He heard laughter, then a sob, a sharp, angry retort, followed by a pleading whisper. It was like listening to a dozen different conversations happening simultaneously, all just beyond the edge of his comprehension, yet strangely compelling, drawing him in. He grabbed his old oil lamp, its weak glow casting long, dancing shadows. He crept to the living room window, pressing his ear against the cold glass. The voices were louder now, just outside his cabin, as if a crowd had gathered in the snow-covered clearing. He heard footsteps, shuffling, dragging, and then a distinct, chilling sound, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sharp, wet, tearing sound. His blood ran cold. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the pipes. This was something else entirely. Backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to think. What could it be? His reclusive neighbors. But why would they be having such strange, unsettling conversations in the dark, in an ice storm? And that growl, it sounded animalistic, primal. He pressed himself against the wall, listening, his breath held captive in his lungs. The voices continued, a relentless, disorienting chorus. They seemed to swirl around his cabin, seeping through the walls, through the floor, through the ceiling, a pervasive, inescapable presence. He could almost feel their cold breath on his neck, their unseen forms brushing against his skin. Then, a new sound emerged, a scratching, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from inside his cabin. He spun around, shining his oil lamp wildly around the room. Nothing. The scratching continued, a rhythmic, scraping sound, like claws on wood, or perhaps something far more sinister. It was coming from the crawl space access panel in the floor. His crawl space, the one he hadn't opened in years. Liam stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. The voices outside intensified, a swirling vortex of sound, a maddening chorus that threatened to overwhelm his senses. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. He could hear something moving inside the crawl space, something heavy, something dragging itself across the dirt, directly beneath his feet. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A badger, a fox, but the sounds were too large, too deliberate, too human. The air grew heavy with a putrid earthy smell, like damp soil and decay. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The voices outside faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Liam stood there, trembling, his oil lamp beam shaking uncontrollably. Then, a low raspy whisper, right next to his ear, so close he could feel the cold breath on his skin. "We're here, Liam," he screamed, a raw, primal scream that tore through the silence, echoing through the darkened cabin. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, falling to the floor. His oil lamp clattered away, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. He scrambled to his feet, blindly fumbling for the door, desperate to escape. He threw it open, bursting into the snow-covered clearing, his eyes wide with terror. The clearing was empty. No crowd, no shuffling footsteps, no growling. Just the swirling snow and the relentless wind. He stood there, panting, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it all? The voices, the scratching, the whisper. But the fear was too real, too visceral. He stumbled back into his cabin, slammed the door shut, and barricaded it with everything he could find. Every piece of furniture, every heavy object. The silence inside was now punctuated by the frantic pounding of his own heart. The power returned with a sudden, blinding flash, followed by the familiar hum of electricity. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered on, revealing his disheveled cabin, the overturned furniture, the scattered blankets. Liam stood there, trembling. The memory of the voices, the scratching, and that chilling whisper burned into his mind. He never told anyone what happened that night. They wouldn't have believed him. They would have said it was the isolation, the cold, the fear playing tricks on his mind, a byproduct of the ice storm. But he knew that for a few terrifying hours, in the absolute darkness of a power outage, he had not been alone. Something had been there, something that whispered his name, something that scratched at his crawlspace door, something that thrived in the absence of light and sound, something that had seeped in from the very fabric of the electrical grid, itself a parasitic entity feeding on the fear of the isolated. And sometimes, when the lights flicker, or the wind howls outside, he still hears those faint, overlapping voices, a chilling reminder of the night he was trapped with the unseen, the unheard, the things that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception. Story 3. The Shadow in the Static. It was a crisp November evening in 2024. Sarah, a young urban explorer and amateur photographer, had convinced her two closest friends, Ben and Chloe, to join her on an overnight trip to an abandoned, supposedly haunted, hydroelectric power station deep in the remote wilderness. The idea was to capture some unique, eerie photographs and experience a thrill. The station, a decaying monument to forgotten industry, stood silent and imposing amidst a dense, ancient forest, miles from any semblance of civilization. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant mournful cry of a coyote, a symphony of desolate tranquility. The last sliver of twilight was fading, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. They had set up their camp in a small, overgrown clearing near the station, a place where the air felt unnaturally heavy and cold. As darkness fully enveloped them, a sudden, violent electrical storm erupted. The sky ripped open with blinding flashes of lightning, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that reverberated through the very ground beneath their feet. And then, inevitably, the power grid, already fragile in this remote area, gave out. The entire region plunged into darkness, save for the sporadic, terrifying flashes of lightning that illuminated the skeletal remains of the power station. Their headlamps, usually reliable, flickered erratically, then died, their batteries drained. By the sudden cold and the intense electromagnetic interference, the cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fireplace. They lit candles, pulled out board games, and tried to make the best of it. It was cozy, almost idyllic at first, a perfect setting for a rustic retreat. As the hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of abating, a subtle shift occurred. The initial thrill began to morph into genuine fear. The flickering shadows cast by the lightning seemed to dance with a malevolent life of their own, transforming familiar trees into grotesque, grasping figures. The wind outside sounded less like a storm and more like a mournful wail, a lament carried on the cold air, a chorus of unseen voices. They started to get on each other's nerves, small arguments flaring up over trivial things. The forced intimacy of the darkness began to fray their nerves, revealing the raw edges of their personalities. A pervasive metallic temps, like ozone in old blood, filled the air. Sarah was in the makeshift tent, trying to find some spare batteries, when she saw it. A shadow, not a shadow cast by the lightning, but a deeper, darker shadow, clinging to the inside of the tent wall. It was too distinct, too solid to be a trick of the light. It was shaped like a human figure, tall and slender, but it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a void in the already profound darkness. It was a perfect silhouette, yet utterly devoid of detail, a blacker-than-black entity that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. She blinked, and it was gone. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of her tired eyes, a figment of her imagination fueled by the isolation and the darkness, the product of her own frayed nerves. But then, she saw it again. Outside the tent flap, just for a fleeting moment, a dark, elongated shape darting from one patch of shadow to another, moving with an unnatural speed and fluidity. Her heart began to pound. She didn't say anything to Ben or Chloe. She didn't want to sound crazy, to break the fragile peace that still existed between them. But she started to feel a profound sense of being watched, a cold, unseen gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness, settling on her, making her skin crawl. The air around them grew colder, despite the relative warmth of their sleeping bags. Later, as the storm raged, they heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum emanating from the abandoned power station. It was too consistent, too mechanical to be the wind or the thunder. It was a low, throbbing vibration that seemed to resonate deep within their chests, a sound that spoke of immense, dormant power. They tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent, a persistent thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Then, the hum was joined by a new sound, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible whine, like 1,000 unseen machines slowly grinding to life. It was a sound that seemed to bypass their ears and burrow directly into their brains, causing a dull, persistent ache behind their eyes. Ben, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. Despite Sarah's protests, he grabbed his own failing headlamp and ventured out into the storm, towards the power station. Chloe and Sarah huddled together, their fear a tangible presence between them. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The hum from the station intensified, now a deafening roar, and the high-pitched whine became a piercing shriek that made their teeth ache. Then, a blinding flash of light erupted from the power station, so intense it momentarily seared their retinas, followed by a guttural, inhuman scream that was abruptly cut short. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the metallic tang in the air became overwhelming. Chloe started to cry, a low, desperate whimper. Sarah, despite her own terror, tried to comfort her, but her eyes were fixed on the power station, now glowing with an eerie, pulsating blue light. The hum and the whine reached a fever pitch, and then, with a sudden violent shudder that shook the very ground, everything went silent. The blue light vanished. The storm, as if on cue, began to subside, the thunder receding into a distant rumble, the lightning becoming less frequent. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise, a heavy, oppressive void that seemed to swallow all sound. They waited. Minutes turned into an hour. Ben didn't return. Sarah, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, knew they had to leave. They packed their meager belongings in a terrified frenzy, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. As they stumbled through the now calm forest, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in pale grays, they passed the abandoned power station. It stood silent and dark, just as it had been when they arrived, but something was different. The air around it felt impossibly cold, and a faint, almost imperceptible static electricity seemed to cling to their skin, making the hairs on their arms stand on end. They never saw Ben again. The authorities, after a brief search, attributed his disappearance to the harsh wilderness and the severe storm. They found no trace of him, no evidence of foul play. Sarah and Chloe never spoke of what they experienced that night, the terror too profound, too unbelievable to articulate. But sometimes, when the lights flicker, or when they hear the distant hum of electrical wires, they remember the profound darkness, the chilling hum, the piercing whine, and the fleeting glimpse of a shadow that seemed to absorb all light. They remember the silent, hungry void that had swallowed their friend, a void that thrived in the absence of power, a void that was waiting, patiently, for the next blackout.